Hi again, everyone. Time for another video, this time on lesson planning. So this is a continuation from the last one on course design. So let's get into it. Okay, so we're going to start with some factors to consider when planning a lesson. So remember, in the course design video, we talked more at a macro level. You're designing an entire program or a course or a curriculum. But now we're looking at the lesson that you're planning to take into the classroom. So on a class-to-class basis, or maybe you're planning a whole unit at a time. So before you even start, you need to consider a few things. And some of these, maybe you need to think about it every single time, and then others maybe just at the beginning as you start to plan your lessons. So you need to think about what's your philosophy of education. You need to always consider second language learning principles. So remember communicative-based learning. You need to add those in. We need to promote automaticity. We need to promote interaction, reward. Those need to be integrated into the lesson. You should think about SLA research on second language acquisition. What are the available methodologies you can use? And when you're a new teacher, maybe you want to keep a list somewhere of different methods that you can use and try to mix it up. Think about the context of your class. What are the different cultural, social dynamics inside? What are the constraints of your school? Think about the stages before and after the lessons. When you design your lesson, what happened last time and what's going to happen in the future. Try to make it a very smooth transition. Make sure you have a focus, and you need to consider your objectives. So I'm going to talk about objectives later in the video, but they basically are the key to the entire lesson plan. Of course, you need to consider your students. You need to design a lesson that matches the characteristics of your students, their learning styles, their likes, and something that can promote their learning. And then, of course, you need to think about a range in abilities of students. And next time there will be a video that talks a little bit more about teaching or planning for students at different levels or differentiated learning. Okay, so we're going to go through the format of a lesson plan, and then in class we'll talk about this a little bit more, but just to go through. Now, there's no set model of how your lesson plan should look, but these things should be inside. So first of all, you should have goals. And you need to think about how your lesson will be designed to meet your goals. So remember, everything that you do should go back to the very beginning. What were your course goals? And then you're going to set objectives for the lesson as well. So the objectives come next. Okay, so for this particular lesson or this particular unit, what are the objectives that you want? So clearly state what you want your students to gain and state what they will do. That means what they will perform. It has to be something you can measure. Avoid vagueness. For example, don't say things like, students will learn about the passive voice. Because how will you evaluate whether they learned or not? What does learn really mean? They learned it, they can see the words and recognize it, or they know how to spell it, or they're able to use it in a sentence. They know the rules. It's really vague, so you need to be very specific. Something that at the end of the lesson, you can ask the students to perform what it is they're supposed to, and then you can evaluate it. Okay, there are two types of objectives that you can write. The first are called terminal objectives. These are the final learning outcomes to be assessed. And then we have what's called enabling objectives. These are the steps in a lesson that lead to the terminal objective. So for example, if your terminal objective is something like students will be able to orally answer yes/no questions that start with be verbs, like are you happy, is he hot, things like that. So the enabling objectives will be all of those steps you take before you get to the final outcome. So what will you do in class that allows them to learn and be able to produce that form? Okay, number 3 is your materials and equipment. So of course, when you're designing your lesson, you need to consider that. There's nothing worse than having a plan and then getting into class and you realize you don't actually have the materials that you need in order to make it run smoothly. So make sure you know what's available before you make your plan, and if there's any kind of equipment or you're going to, have the students make something, try it out first. That way you can problem solve it. Okay, number 4 then is the procedures. So of course any lesson plan needs to have the procedures. You should have some kind of opening statement or activity that primes students' background knowledge. You should always start with something like that. Don't just dive into the new content. Get students to think first. Then of course you have a set of activities and techniques for whole class work, pair work, group work, teacher talk, student talk, and it should be designed in this way. So how much time are you going to spend letting students work on their own? How much time in groups? How much time are you going to talk? And then how many opportunities are you going to give them to talk? And then at the end, of course, you should have some kind of closure or wind down. Don't just end your class abruptly. You can have review, you can have some kind of review activity, you can let the students do some reflection. Many ways to do this, and my suggestion is to change it up every time. Okay, you should also have some kind of assessment throughout the lesson. Now this could be formative assessment, and of course you need to plan summative assessment too. When are you going to actually evaluate them or measure their progress? But you should plan every single lesson. How are you going to assess whether they are learning the objectives that they're supposed to? So informal assessment takes place, but don't just let it happen randomly. Put it in your lesson plan. Formative assessment for this activity is teacher observation. Formative assessment, question and answer, group work, so whatever it is, make sure you write it in your lesson plan. That way you know that you're actually going to do it. And that includes assessing yourself, not just the students. Assess your teaching, assess your planning. When you're done a lesson, if there's some part of the lesson plan that didn't work out, make a note of it so that next time you don't make the same mistake again, because next year you will totally forget what happened at this time. Okay, and you should also plan in your lesson extra classwork and or homework. Plan with care. You need to have something just in case the lesson finishes too early. There's nothing worse. You got 10 minutes left in class and you're not sure what to do. You don't have enough time to start the next lesson, so you have this kind of dead space, and then you have to come up with something on the fly. So it's better to plan it out. What will you do if there's extra time? Now, in terms of homework, plan with care. Homework should have a purpose. It shouldn't just be busy work. When students go home to do homework, it shouldn't just be writing sentences or writing words over and over and over again. It should have some meaning. Maybe they need to look up the answers. They need to write something, some kind of reflection. Homework should be the place where they can do something that they can't regularly do in class. Okay, so guidelines for lesson planning then. How do you begin? So first of all, you should look at your textbook chapter or unit, determine what your topic and purpose is. Think about that first. Don't just go by the pages. Today I need to cover 2 pages. Okay, what's inside? Not like that. What's your purpose? What's the topic? This will allow you to start with some kind of good background knowledge activation activity because you know what the point is. By the end of this lesson, I want my students to do this. Okay, so where do I start? How can I start in a way that activates their background knowledge? Okay, then you need to write your terminal objectives, and then you need to look at the material and ask yourself, okay, so in this book, which exercises will I use? Which ones will I delete? And then what do I need to add to make it complete? And then draft an outline, okay, a rough copy of your lesson plan, and then plan your step-by-step procedures. So what will I do first? What will I do second? How much time do I think that will take? Even if you don't type it out formally for every class, because that's a lot of work, just a rough plan will really help you a lot when it comes time to teach. Okay, number 2 is to have some variety, sequencing, pacing, and timing. So make sure you have variety. Don't do the same thing every class. Once students know what's coming next, they get really bored. So make sure you mix it up a little bit. Keep them on their toes, so to speak. You should sequence everything that you do that builds toward your ultimate goal or the objective. So make sure that everything you're doing actually leads to the final objective of your lesson. Think about the pacing. You don't want to move too slowly, but you also don't want to go too fast. You have to make sure that the students are really learning. A lot of new teachers just jump to every part. Part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4. But they don't actually stop and assess the students. Are they really getting it? So make sure you figure out what's the appropriate pace for your students. And then, of course, timing. So how long do you need for each activity? You don't want your lecture to be 35 minutes and then you got 5 minutes for speaking practice. So try to plan that out appropriately. Okay, as we said, make sure you have a contingency plan, always have a backup plan, and be flexible. If you're running out of time and you need to finish something, but you know that they need extra time so that they can learn that properly, then maybe you need to move it until the next week. Don't try to rush something that needs time. So you have to be flexible. You have to change your lesson sometimes while you're teaching. If something's not working, don't be afraid to just stop it and try something else in the middle of class. Okay, you need to gauge difficulty. So that difficulty could be caused by the tasks. So make your directions clear by writing them out ahead of time. Think about linguistic difficulties. So think about what the students are able to do, and what you want is something that's just a little bit above their level, but not too high. However, that becomes challenging with the different levels of students. So it takes time to figure out what's the appropriate place to hit. Okay, you have to think about individual differences. So your technique should have a range of easy to difficult items. Start with the easy ones and move on to the more difficult. So at least at the very beginning, you start with something easy. The students who are not as proficient in English, at least they can have some success early. As it gets more difficult, then maybe they need help from their classmates. But it needs to get to a certain level so that the higher level students are still challenged. So ask the lower ability students to answer the easier items. Don't let you're gonna have some students who are very, very good at English who raise their hand all the time. Save the more difficult questions for them. Have techniques in class that involve all the students actively, not just the ones who are good at English. So grouping is something you have to think about. There's no right way to do this. It could be they're all the same ability, so high together, mid together, low together, or you have a range from high to low. You have to figure out what works with the students that you have, and for your own personality and teaching method. But one thing that you can think about is if you use a lot of group work, it gives you a chance to walk around and help those students who maybe need that extra help. Okay, and then you should always consider student talk and teacher talk. There needs to be a balance, and I can promise you that most teachers don't plan this out, and it ends up being teacher talk for probably 90 to 95% of the time, but it shouldn't be that way. Students need more chance to practice talking, so plan it in your lesson plan. When are the students going to talk? Don't just say, oh, Q&A, they will talk. Q&A doesn't work that way. Q&A means the teacher asks a question, student answers. How many students are really answering? 5, 6 out of 30 some, maybe even 40. So you need to have a better plan so that students are able to practice speaking. Okay, number 7, adapting to an established curriculum. So when you're lesson planning, you're not supposed to be writing an entire curriculum, but actually follow an established one. Maybe your school just gives you a textbook. Maybe they give you a curriculum. You have to find out when you get there. But there's always the 12-year basic curriculum guidelines. They do have some information inside. And you follow the factors that we talked about in the course design. So do situation analysis, needs analysis, supporting materials, assessment requirements. You can use those for your planning. Okay, and then classroom lesson notes. So you should always think about, okay, I made this really detailed lesson plan, but what am I really going to carry into the classroom? Am I going to look at that very detailed lesson plan, or am I going to write some notes? Or if I use slides, will my slides be the guide that tell me, put some little notes on the slides to remind you what to do? Whatever works for you. Maybe you have little note cards, maybe you have a piece of paper up at the podium where you're standing, but plan that out. Okay, so we're gonna move on now to learning objectives and how to write them, because in my opinion, this is quite challenging to write objectives that are not vague and they are measurable. So we're going to use this idea of using Bloom's taxonomy. Hopefully you've learned Bloom's taxonomy before, but if not, it's okay. I'm going to talk about it a little bit here. So in terms of learning objectives, okay, we know that they are the goals to be achieved by the student by the end of the lesson or the end of the unit or the end of the course. But for our purposes today, we are talking about the objectives for this particular lesson. Okay, they describe the base knowledge and the skills we want students to learn. We want to state what students can do at the end of a lesson. So this word is very important. That means we need to have some action verbs in our objectives. What can they do? Not what will they know necessarily. Okay? Now your choice of materials, topics, logical structure of content, presentation directly affects the objectives to be achieved. So you have to obviously match them to what you have in your classroom. Okay, so we're gonna follow what's called the ABCD method, and I'll give you some examples, and then in class we're gonna practice. Okay, so A stands for audience, B stands for behavior, C stands for condition, and D stands for degree. So I'm going to quickly define each one. So audience, who will achieve the objective? Obviously, for your case, that will be the students. Okay, behavior. So use action verbs to write student behaviors that are measurable and observable, that show their ability to master the objective. So again, if you use the word learn, students will learn something. Can you observe learning? Not directly. Maybe indirectly you can prove it, but then use the word that actually shows what they're doing. And that's why we're going to use Bloom's taxonomy, because the different levels of Bloom's taxonomy, we can get some really good action verbs that match that particular level. And if we use Bloom's taxonomy, which hopefully you've learned before, what we're hoping is to get to the top level in terms of students' cognitive processing skills. We don't want students to stay at the bottom level. We want them to use their higher order thinking skills. So making learning objectives that use those higher order skills by using the verbs that match them is much better for the students. So I'll show you what I'm talking about. Okay, next one is condition. So state the condition under which the behavior is to be carried out. This one is optional. And then the last one is degree. Determine the criterion that shows an acceptable performance. For example, speed, accuracy, quality. And this one's also optional. Okay, so let me give you some examples. Okay, and I got them color coded. Okay, so audience is this color, behavior, condition, and degree. Okay, so here's the first one. This is a mathematics learning objective. So students will be able to apply the standard deviation rule to the special case of distributions having a normal shape. So if you remember your math class, that bell curve shape, that's what we're talking about here. So who's the audience? Students. What's the behavior? Apply. So here is the action verb that I'm talking about. So apply the standard deviation rule. And then this one has a condition. So when do you apply the rule? To the special case of distributions having a normal shape. See, there's no degree. This one is optional. Okay, next one is about needs analyses. Okay, so given a specific case study, learners will be able to conduct at least 2 needs analyses. Okay, so again, audience, learners, behavior, conduct needs analyses. So this is measurable, right? If the students can do it, then you can measure it and you can assess it. Okay, this one also has a condition, so it's a specific case study, and this one has a degree, 2 needs analyses. Okay, Here is a science one. So given a diagram of the eye, students will be able to label the 9 extraocular muscles and describe. So again, action verbs: label, describe. At least 2 of their actions, okay? So audience, behavior, condition, degree. All right, now let's get into one about teaching. Actually, this one is about you. This is your, for your course. So students will be able to evaluate 3 types of assessment validity on exams that test English proficiency. So what this means is you will be able to evaluate whether these English proficiency exams are valid. Okay, so again, behavior, evaluate is our action verb, degree 3 types, and then condition is on English proficiency exams. All right, now they don't need to be this complicated. It can actually just be audience and behavior, and maybe degree if you want to add how many times or how fast you want them to be able to do it. Now, if we take a look at, let me go through these first, and then we'll go through Bloom's taxonomy. So in terms of audience, you need to establish their prior knowledge. Do they know the material you want to present? What experiences do they have coming to the classroom? What motivates them? What are their values? What are their personality types? This is important for writing your objectives. Okay, in terms of behavior. Now, if you've learned about Bloom's, if you haven't, I strongly suggest you take some time and go back and read about Bloom's taxonomy because it's really important in terms of activating your students' cognition. But we know that according to Bloom, learning takes place in 3 different learning domains: cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. Now, we can take any of these 3, depending on what you're doing in your class, and use them to write our objectives. So, sorry, give me a second to get my face out of the way. All right. So if you look at the cognitive domain, so we started this is opposite of what it would look like in the Bloom's taxonomy triangle or pyramid. But remember is the very bottom level. It's low level cognitive skill. So what does remember mean? Well, retrieving and recalling relevant information. Now look at all these verbs over here. These are the verbs you use in your objectives. So recall, identify, define, recite. Okay, the second level up is understand. So what does understand mean? Here's the definition. Then look at all these verbs you can use. Interpret, exemplify, classify, summarize, and so on. Okay, third level of the cognitive domain is apply. So what does apply mean? Here's the definition, and then here are all the verbs you can use for your learning objectives. Okay, number 4, analyze. So what does analyze mean? Okay, and then look at all these verbs: figure, find, solve, change, rate, support, recommend, appraise. And then the last one is create. Okay, so again, all these verbs here: generate, plan, produce, develop, create, design, devise, and so on. So when you're making your objectives, it's really good practice to come and choose one of these verbs. These are verbs that you can measure and assess. Was the student able to construct something or produce something? You can measure that. Okay, but we can also look at the affective domain. So in the affective domain, I'm not going to go through each one. You can take your time, pause the video, or look at the slides that I've given you and read through these. But we've got receiving, responding, valuing, organizing, and then we've got all of our verbs here and the descriptions. And we've also got characterizing or internalizing. Okay, again, the definition and the verbs. And then we've also got the psychomotor domain. So observing, imitating, practicing. So for example, if you're teaching PE and you want to write these kind of objectives, so you've got all kinds of different ones you can do: observe, imitate, practice, adapt. Okay, so last one is some action words to avoid in your lesson objectives. So as I said, your objectives should be free of vague or ambiguous phrases. Try not to use words like believe, perceive, realize, and so on. All of these words on here. How can you measure whether someone feels something? How can you measure if they hear something or see something or listen to something? these are very, very difficult to determine whether or not. Let me give you an example. If your objective says students are able to listen to the English conversation, how will you give them a score on that? How can you? How do you know they're really listening? You cannot see what's going on inside their brain. So when your objectives use these kind of vague verbs, or they're ambiguous, then it's really hard for you to determine whether or not you were successful in getting them to learn the objectives. So be really careful when you design your lesson plans that you start really carefully with this type of method, the ABCD method. It works really well. Once you write those objectives, it's much easier to design a lesson and the procedures that go along with it that will allow the students to learn what you want them to learn. All right, that's it, everybody. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time. Bye.